There comes a moment in life that no one prepares you for, not in school, not in religion, not even in family. It's the moment you realize you don't fit anymore, not because your family is bad, not because you're ungrateful, but because you have grown into a version of yourself that no longer matches the emotional climate you were raised in. And that realization hurts. Outgrowing your family is not betrayal, even though it can feel like the deepest form of disloyalty you will ever experience. From a very young age, you are emotionally trained to associate love with loyalty, obedience with goodness, and sameness with belonging. You learn, often without words, that being accepted means fitting into the emotional shape your family has created for you. Their fears become your limits, their beliefs become your rules, and their unhealed wounds quietly shape the role you are expected to play. So when you begin to grow beyond those invisible boundaries, your nervous system reacts as if you are doing something wrong, even when your growth is healthy, necessary, and long overdue. The inner conflict that arises during this stage is intense because it touches the oldest part of the human psyche, the need to belong. As children, survival depends on attachment. Approval means safety. Disapproval feels like danger. This conditioning doesn't simply disappear when you become an adult. It lives in your body as guilt, anxiety, and self-doubt. That is why choosing your own path can feel like abandoning the very people who once protected you, even when they are no longer able to support who you are becoming. The pain is not proof that you are betraying them. It is proof that you are breaking away from an old emotional contract that was formed when you had no choice. Outgrowing your family often means outgrowing patterns that were normalized in your upbringing. You may start to question beliefs that were once presented as absolute truths. You may become aware of emotional dynamics that once felt normal but were actually unhealthy. You may realize that certain forms of communication, control, or sacrifice were never expressions of love, but adaptations to unresolved pain passed down through generations. When you begin to see these patterns clearly, you no longer participate in them unconsciously. This shift alone can feel threatening to a family system that depends on everyone playing their assigned roles to maintain emotional stability. What many people don't realize is that families are not just groups of individuals, they are emotional systems. Each person's behavior is connected to the balance of the whole. When one member grows, heals, or changes, the entire system is affected. The system may respond with subtle pressure to return you to your old role. This can show up as criticism, guilt-tripping, emotional withdrawal, or accusations of arrogance and ingratitude. Not because your growth is wrong, but because it disrupts what was familiar. Your evolution highlights what others are not ready to confront within themselves, and that reflection can be uncomfortable. Loyalty to your family is often confused with loyalty to their limitations. You may feel obligated to remain emotionally small so that others do not feel insecure. You may be expected to carry family expectations that were never aligned with your true nature. Over time, this creates an internal split, the person you are becoming versus the person you are expected to remain. Living in that split leads to quiet resentment, exhaustion, and a slow loss of authenticity. Choosing to honor your own growth is not an act of rebellion, it is an act of psychological honesty. It is the decision to live in alignment with your inner truth rather than perform a version of yourself designed to keep others comfortable. It is also important to understand that outgrowing your family does not mean rejecting your roots. It means no longer being confined by them. You can carry gratitude for what was given while acknowledging what was missing. You can hold compassion for your family's limitations without allowing those limitations to define your future. Maturity is the ability to see your family clearly, without idealization and without hatred, and still choose to walk your own path. This kind of differentiation is not cold or heartless. It is deeply respectful of both your humanity and theirs. The grief that comes with this process is real. You may mourn the fantasy that your growth would be celebrated. You may feel the ache of emotional distance, even when no one has explicitly pushed you away. You may wrestle with the fear of becoming too different to belong. Yet this grief is part of shedding an identity that was built for survival, not for wholeness. The pain is not the cost of betrayal. It is the cost of becoming conscious of who you are beyond inherited roles and unconscious loyalties. Individuation requires separation because becoming a real individual is impossible if your inner world is still governed by the emotional expectations, beliefs, and unresolved conflicts of the environment you were formed in. In early life, identity is borrowed. You absorb ways of thinking, reacting, pleasing, and protecting yourself from the people around you. This is not a failure, it is how the psyche learns to survive. But what once protected you can later imprison you. Transition from borrowed identity to authentic identity demands a psychological distance from the structures that shaped you, not out of rejection, but out of necessity. Separation does not begin with physical distance. It begins with inner differentiation. It is the moment you start to recognize which thoughts are truly yours and which ones were inherited. You begin to notice that certain fears you carry were never born from your own experience, but from the anxieties of those who raised you. You realize that some of your self-doubt echoes voices you once depended on for approval. This awareness creates an internal tension because it challenges the foundation of belonging. When you step back emotionally, feel exposed, as though you are standing without the protective armor of familiar roles. Yet this vulnerability is precisely what allows your authentic self to emerge. The psyche resists separation because attachment is wired into survival. As a child, closeness to caregivers is essential. The nervous system learns that being accepted means being safe, and being different can mean being abandoned. Even in adulthood, this conditioning remains active. Choosing to individuate can therefore trigger primal fear, fear of rejection, fear of isolation, fear of being seen as disloyal. These fears are not signs that separation is wrong. They are signs that you are stepping beyond the emotional blueprint that once defined your sense of safety. Growth feels dangerous when safety has been confused with familiarity. Separation also involves withdrawing energy from unconscious family roles. Many people grow up occupying specific emotional positions: the rescuer, the mediator, the achiever, the invisible one, the emotional container for others' pain. These roles are rarely chosen consciously. They are assigned by the needs of the system. Individuation disrupts these arrangements. When you no longer carry what was never yours to carry, others may feel the absence of your emotional labor. This can create resistance, not because you are doing harm, but because the system must now confront what it avoided by relying on you. The discomfort that follows is part of the reorganization of relationships around a more authentic self. True separation does not mean cutting off connection. It means relating without fusion. Fusion occurs when your sense of self is entangled with the expectations and the emotional reactions of others. In a fused state, your choices are unconsciously shaped by the need to maintain harmony, avoid conflict, or preserve an image. Individuation requires loosening this fusion so that your actions come from inner alignment rather than emotional obligation. This shift can feel like becoming colder or more distant, but what is actually happening is a movement toward clarity. You begin to relate as a person, not as a role, and that changes the emotional tone of every interaction. The process of separation often brings up grief because it involves letting go of the fantasy of unconditional understanding from those closest to you. There is a quiet mourning when you realize that some people can only meet you at the level of their own awareness. This realization can be painful because it confronts the hope that growth would naturally be mirrored and celebrated by those who share your history. Separation means accepting that your inner development may outpace the emotional development of your environment. It means learning to tolerate being misunderstood without collapsing back into old patterns of self-betrayal for the sake of belonging. As individuation deepens, you begin to experience a different quality of connection, Relationships become less about approval and more about presence. You are no longer seeking permission to exist as you are. You are allowing others to be who they are without needing them to validate your inner reality. This creates a subtle but profound shift in how you experience closeness. Connection becomes a choice rather than a survival strategy. You can stay emotionally open without being emotionally dependent, and you can maintain boundaries without shutting down your capacity to care. Separation, in this sense, is not a movement away from love, but a movement toward a form of love that does not require the erasure of the self. The guilt is inherited, not chosen, and this becomes clear when you begin to examine where your sense of responsibility truly comes from. Much of the guilt people carry in their adult lives does not originate from actual wrongdoing, but from emotional conditioning formed long before they had the capacity to consent to it. As children, you learn what brings approval and what brings disapproval. You learn which emotions are welcome and which ones are inconvenient. Over time, this creates an internal compass that is not based on your own moral truth, but on the emotional comfort of those around you. The guilt you feel when you grow, separate, or choose differently is often the echo of early emotional training rather than a reflection of real harm. Inherited guilt is subtle because it presents itself as conscience. It feels like a moral signal, warning you that you are doing something wrong by prioritizing your own needs, setting boundaries, or stepping outside prescribed roles. But when you look closer, you may notice that this guilt arises even when your actions are healthy, respectful, and necessary for your well-being. You might feel guilty for saying no, guilty for growing old dynamics, guilty for choosing a life path that does not align with family expectations. This kind of guilt is not about ethics, it is about attachment. It is the residue of an emotional environment where love was linked to compliance and belonging was linked to self-suppression. A family-wide systems often transmit unspoken rules about who you are allowed to be. These rules are rarely articulated directly, but they are enforced through emotional responses. Approval reinforces conformity, disappointment or withdrawal punishes deviation. Over time, the child internalizes these reactions as an inner authority figure that monitors behavior. When you begin to challenge inherited beliefs or roles, this internalized authority reacts with guilt, even if no one is actively shaming you. The voice of guilt becomes self-generated, making it feel personal and chosen, when in reality it is the internal continuation of external conditioning. This inherited guilt can become especially heavy when you start to heal. Growth often involves naming patterns that were previously normalized. You may recognize emotional neglect, unspoken expectations, or cycles of sacrifice that shaped your early life. Acknowledging these realities can trigger guilt, as though seeing clearly is itself an act of betrayal. You might feel disloyal for recognizing that what you received was imperfect. Yet this guilt is not a moral response. It is the emotional discomfort of challenging a narrative that once provided psychological safety. The mind clings to familiar stories because they offer coherence, even when those stories minimize your own experience. Inherited guilt also thrives on the belief that you are responsible for other people's emotional states. Many people grow up learning to manage the moods, expectations, or needs of caregivers. When love is inconsistent or conditional, children often become hyper-attuned to what keeps others stable. This creates a sense of duty that extends into adulthood. You may feel guilty for causing discomfort, even when that discomfort arises from others confronting their own limitations. This misplaced sense of responsibility is a form of inherited burden, where emotional labor is passed down without conscious consent. Letting go of this burden can feel like selfishness at first, not because it is wrong, but because your nervous system is accustomed to equating self-abandonment with virtue. As you become more aware of this inherited guilt, you may notice how deeply it is embedded in your body. It can show up as tension when you assert yourself, as anxiety when you choose rest over obligation, or as a vague sense of unease when you prioritize your own growth. These reactions are not signs that you are harming anyone. They are signs that you are stepping outside an old emotional contract. The body remembers patterns of attachment long after the mind understands the need for change. This is why working through inherited guilt requires patience and compassion toward yourself. You are not undoing a simple habit, you are reconditioning a deeply ingrained survival response. Releasing inherited guilt does not mean becoming indifferent to others. It means learning to distinguish between genuine ethical responsibility and emotional conditioning. Genuine responsibility arises when your actions cause real harm. Inherited guilt arises when your authenticity disrupts familiar dynamics. The difference can be subtle, especially when you have been trained to prioritize harmony over truth. Over time, as you practice listening to your own inner compass, you begin to feel the difference in your body. One kind of discomfort comes from acting a guy against your values. The other comes from acting in alignment with them while breaking unconscious expectations. Learning to tolerate the second kind of discomfort is part of reclaiming your psychological autonomy. You can love your family without becoming them, even though many people grow up believing that love requires imitation, loyalty requires sameness, and belonging requires self-sacrifice. In early life, connection is built through mirroring. Children adapt to the emotional tone, values, and coping styles of their caregivers because that is how closeness is formed. Over time, this adaptation can harden into an identity that feels natural, even when it no longer reflects who you truly are. When you begin to sense that your inner world is different from the environment you are shaped by, a quiet tension emerges between love and authenticity, as if choosing yourself means choosing against those who raised you. This tension is rooted in a misunderstanding of what love actually is. Love is often confused with agreement, compliance, and emotional merging. In many families, closeness is maintained by unspoken rules about what can be expressed, questioned, or changed. You may have learned that challenging certain beliefs creates conflict, that setting boundaries causes emotional distance, or that choosing a different path invites disapproval. Over time, these experiences teach you to equate love with emotional conformity. Yet love that requires the erasure of your individuality is not love as presence. It is love as performance. It asks you to remain a version of yourself that fits the comfort of others rather than grow into the fullness of who you are becoming. Loving why? Our family without becoming them requires a shift from fusion to differentiation. Fusion is when your sense of self is tightly bound to the emotional atmosphere of your family system. Your choices are shaped by the need to maintain harmony, avoid tension, or preserve an image of closeness. Differentiation is the capacity to stay emotionally connected while remaining psychologically separate. It allows you to hold your own values, perspectives, and boundaries without withdrawing from relationship. This shift can feel unfamiliar because many people were not taught that connection and individuality can coexist. Instead, they learn that being close means being similar, and being different means being distant. As you begin to differentiate, you may notice resistance both internally and externally. Internally, old patterns of guilt, fear, or self-doubt may surface when you choose differently. Externally, others may interpret your growth as rejection, even when your intention is simply to be honest about who you are. This misunderstanding arises because changes in one person alter the emotional balance of the whole system. When you stop participating in familiar patterns, the absence of your old role can be felt as loss by those who relied on it. This does not mean you are causing harm. It means the system is adjusting to a new configuration where you are no longer defined by previous expectations. Loving without becoming also involves accepting the limits of what your family can offer emotionally. You may hope that as you grow, those closest to you will naturally grow with you. Sometimes they do, and sometimes they cannot. This realization can be painful because it confronts the longing to be fully seen and understood by the people who share your history. Maturity involves recognizing that love does not require perfect emotional alignment. You can care deeply for people who do not fully understand your inner journey. You can appreciate what they are able to give without demanding that they meet needs they are not equipped to meet. This acceptance does not diminish love, it grounds it in reality rather than fantasy. Maintaining love without self-erasure also means redefining loyalty. Loyalty does not have to mean remaining emotionally small or suppressing your truth. It can mean showing up with honesty, even when honesty creates discomfort. It can mean honoring your own growth while still holding compassion for the limitations of those who shaped you. When you no longer seek validation from your family for your becoming, you create space for a more adult form of relationship. You are no longer asking to be approved. You are offering your presence as you are. This changes the quality of connection from one based on dependency to one based on mutual recognition. As differentiation deepens, your relationships may become quieter, less emotionally charged, and more spacious. You may feel less compelled to explain yourself, justify your choices, or manage the emotional reactions of others. This does not mean you care less. It means you are no longer measuring love by how much of yourself you give away. Love becomes something you extend freely, rather than something you trade for acceptance. In this space, you can hold warmth and boundaries at the same time. You can remain open without being porous, and you can remain connected without losing the shape of your own inner life. Your soul knows when it's time to leave the old identity, long before your mind is ready to accept it. There is often a quiet restlessness that begins beneath the surface of your daily life, a subtle sense that the version of you that once felt natural now feels tight, limiting, or strangely empty. You may still be doing the same things, playing the same roles, meeting the same expectations, yet something inside you feels out of place. This feeling is not random dissatisfaction. It is an inner signal that the structure you built to survive a previous chapter of your life can no longer contain the person you are becoming. Old identities form as adaptations. They are shaped by the emotional environment you grew up in, the roles you learned to play to receive love, and the strategies you developed to feel safe. At one point, these identities were necessary. They allowed you to navigate relationships, avoid rejection, and find a sense of belonging. Over time, however, what once protected you can begin to limit you. The identity that kept you accepted may now keep you constrained. The personality that once helped you cope may now keep you disconnected from your deeper truth. When this shift occurs, the soul responds with discomfort, signaling that the current form no longer matches your inner reality. This inner signal is often misunderstood as boredom, dissatisfaction, or restlessness. You might feel drawn to new ideas, different ways of living, or unfamiliar inner questions without knowing why. You may feel a growing dissonance between how you present yourself and how you feel inside. This dissonance can be unsettling because identity provides a sense of stability. Letting go of an old self feels like stepping into uncertainty. The mind prefers what is known, even when what is known has become constricting. The soul, however, is oriented toward wholeness rather than comfort, and it continues to nudge you toward growth, even when that growth disrupts familiar patterns. Leaving an old identity often brings a period of emotional confusion. You may feel as though you are in between versions of yourself, no longer fully aligned with who you were, but not yet grounded in who you are becoming. This in-between state can feel disorienting because many of the external markers of identity, such as roles, relationships, and routines, may begin to shift. Others may notice that you seem different, less predictable, or less willing to conform to expectations. Internally, you may struggle with doubt, wondering if you are losing yourself rather than finding yourself. Yet this uncertainty is part of the shedding process, where the psyche loosens its grip on a form that no longer fits. The resistance to leaving an old identity often comes from fear, out of loss. Identity is tied to belonging, recognition, and safety. When you change, you risk altering how others relate to you. You may fear disappointing people who are accustomed to a certain version of you. You may fear losing approval, stability, or even love. These fears can keep you tethered to an identity that feels familiar but increasingly hollow. The soul's call to change is not a demand for abandonment of all that you were. It is an invitation to integrate what was useful and release what has become restrictive. This process is not about rejecting your past self, but about honoring its purpose while allowing it to evolve. As you begin to listen more closely to this inner knowing, you may notice moments of clarity that arise spontaneously. These moments can come through intuition, emotional reactions, or a sense of resonance with new possibilities. You may feel energized by ideas that once seemed foreign, or drained by situations that once felt normal. This shift emotional response is part of the soul's guidance system, redirecting your energy toward what aligns with your emerging self. The more you pay attention to these subtle cues, the easier it becomes to discern what supports your growth and what keeps you anchored to an outdated version of who you are. Letting go of an old identity is rarely dramatic. It is often a series of small, quiet choices. It may involve setting boundaries where you once overextended, expressing truths you once suppressed, or pursuing paths that feel uncertain but meaningful. Each small act of alignment weakens the hold of the old form and strengthens your connection to the deeper current of your becoming. Over time, these CES, accumulate into a new way of being that feels more spacious and authentic. The transition can be lonely at moments, not because you are losing your essence, but because you are no longer hiding behind a version of yourself that once made belonging easier.